The arrival of American B-2s into Iran during the early moments of Operation Epic Fury was almost a death knell for the country's regime. Bunkers, bases, and missile launch sites were taken out in an instant. Now the US has gone a step further. Another even more massive B-2 strike has just hit Iran, leading to America's stealth bomber to take out some of the biggest targets that Iran had left to lose. This is destruction on a scale that Iran never expected, and more is coming. America's B-2 Spirit stealth bombers have followed up their initial assault on Iran by flying missions even deeper into the country, where they have hammered dozens of ballistic missile sites that Iran has built underground and in its mountains. Those sites are being pelted with 2,000-pound penetrator bombs, which are destroying whatever protection they had and opening up opportunities for follow-up attacks that cripple Iran's ability to launch ballistic missiles. This is destroying Iran's ability to fight back against the US. The country's planned saturation strategy, which we'll be digging into later in the video, has been shattered even before it started. And it's all due to the B-2s and their targeting of what have become known as Iran's missile cities. These cities are vast and they lie at the heart of Iran's entire strategy. El Pais reported on them on March 2nd, noting that Iran possesses a large ballistic missile stockpile of 3,000 weapons as of 2022, which hit hard, even if questions remain about their accuracy. For the US, taking these ballistic missiles out of the equation is key to its strategy in Iran. To do that, the US has to hit the missile cities. Buried deep underground, sometimes as deep as 500 meters or over 1,640 feet, these cities are massive networks where Iran keeps its ballistic missiles and the launchers that it needs to fire them at its enemies. Iran has already proven that these missile cities work as they targeted US bases throughout the Middle East in the aftermath of America's Operation Epic Fury. However, the scale of those strikes has slowed down dramatically as the US and its B-2 bombers have taken the approach of destroying the openings built into the missile cities that allow Iran to quickly wheel out launchers, fire, and then hide. That strategy isn't working out too well for Iran. The US and Israel can respond to each launch in minutes, as you'll learn later on. But what the US has with the missile cities is a combination of Iran's biggest threat and, as it turns out, one of the country's worst vulnerabilities. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, which says that the wave of heavy bombing that the US is unleashing on these hidden missile cities is essentially entombing the missiles and launchers held within, making them practically useless. Iran has tried to account for this before the strike started, the outlet adds, by dispersing some of its launchers and missiles around the country, but that negates the entire point of the missile cities in the first place. Funnily enough, the same could be said of the B-2s that are bombing these cities into oblivion. With its latest round of strikes, the US is making the missile cities a non-factor. The results of America's latest B-2 sorties is that Iran's entire strategy has been crippled before it ever managed to get off the ground. Max Afterburner explains in his coverage of the new B-2 strikes, stating, "This is straight-up B-2 air power dominance, long-range missions, stealth penetration, and precision strikes that have already slashed Iran's missile barrages by around 90%. That number doesn't come out of nowhere. The head of US Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, said as much on March 6th when he reported that Iran's ballistic missile launches are down 90% compared to the first day of the war, and its B-2 bombers carrying 2,000-pound bombs are the reason why. What these bombers have managed to achieve is the destruction of Iran's missile saturation strategy, which lies at the heart of its entire military doctrine. There's a reason why Iran built a stockpile of around 3,000 ballistic missiles. Its plan, no matter what adversary it faced, was always to unleash wave after wave of these missiles alongside drones to devastate its enemy. What's happening instead is that the overwhelming force of this kind of missile and bomb strategy has been turned against Iran, and it's America's B-2s that lie at the heart of everything because they have stopped Iran from being able to strike back. Iran's tactics are saturation tactics, Afterburner explains, adding, "So they want to overwhelm those interceptor missiles as best they can. These interceptors are being fired off by US warships and bases throughout the Middle East to prevent Iran's missiles from touching down and causing damage. They are valuable, no matter what way you look at it, but America's use of its B-2 bombers has meant that Iran can't saturate as intended. That means fewer expensive interceptors are used as Iran has been forced to move to a more limited approach that we'll dig into deeper if you stick with us." Iran's strategic goal before the US struck was to build an arsenal of 8,000 ballistic missiles, the Alma Research and Education Center claims. That would generate a target saturation capability that could overwhelm Israeli defense systems, the outlet claims, in addition to being used against any other enemy that dared to cross Iran's path. With its B-2s, the US has unleashed a hailstorm of penetrator bombs that have eradicated the entire doctrine. And this is how the bombers did it. In the 72 hours leading up to March 6th, America's bomber force unleashed attacks on 200 targets deep inside Iran, including several close to the capital city of Tehran. This force included other bombers in addition to the B-2s. Still, it was the B-2s that unleashed their 2,000-pound penetrator bombs against some of Iran's most deeply buried and closely guarded ballistic missile launchers. In other words, the US has been doing far more than launching strikes at a distance using standoff munitions. The B-2's stealth capabilities have allowed it to get up close and personal with the targets that the US needed to strike, which has been key to the massive degradation of Iran's missile capabilities that we're now seeing. That degradation has been made possible by the BLU-109. The 2,000-pound penetrator that we've mentioned several times already was the main weapon of choice for the B-2 bombers during this second round of strikes, and there's a good reason for that, as the BLU-109 provides just enough of what the US needed to achieve its goals in Iran, while allowing the US to keep an even greater threat in reserve that it can call upon when the time comes. Degal covers the basics of the bomb, noting that it's manufactured by Lockheed Martin and that it is a high-explosive blast fragmentation warhead that has a steel alloy case designed specifically to punch through hardened targets, such as the bunkers that Iran uses to protect its missile launchers. We don't know how many of these bombs the US has in its stockpiles, though Degal says that 600 have been sold to the United Arab Emirates. If that's the case, we have to assume that the US has amassed many more of these bombs for itself, giving its B-2s the capability to launch dozens per strike at a target. Specifically, the B-2s would likely have used the BLU-109B variant of the warhead, which is essentially a slimline Mark 84 with penetrative abilities. America's B-2s may have also had the option of deploying these powerful bombs from a distance, as the warhead has been used with GBU-31 guided bombs and both GBU-24 and GBU-27 laser-guided bombs, among others, in the past. So the US packed one of its most versatile weapons in terms of targeting capabilities into its B-2s for this latest round of strikes. Max Afterburner explains more, stating that BLU-109s loaded into GBU-31s can punch through earth, rock, and reinforced concrete, typically about 4 to 6 feet of concrete, or maybe even way deeper if it was just soil before the delayed fuse is set off. Once that delayed fuse is set off, about 500 pounds of explosive tears through whatever target America's B-2s strike, which generates a massive shockwave that levels everything in its path. Entire tunnels collapse, underground bunkers disappear forever, and they take the missiles and launchers that the US wants to take out of the game with them. But hold on a second, you might be thinking. Earlier you told us that some of Iran's missile cities can be literally thousands of feet underground. What is a bomb that penetrates barely a fraction of that going to do to stop Iran from using these cities? It's a very good question, and we'll answer it in just a moment. But before we go deeper into that, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to hit the button so you never miss a video. So the key to the BLU-109's success lies in two things: the specific targets that America's B-2s hit with it, and the way it uses the bombs. On the target front, the US isn't looking for its bomb to burrow so deeply underground that it can take out a missile city. What's more important to these underground cities, which are basically massive networks of underground tunnels, are entrances and exits. A missile can't be launched from thousands of feet underground. The launcher needs to be brought out into the open, even if that means a door built into a mountain to deliver its payload. That's what the US has been hitting with its B-2 bombers. It's collapsing the entrances and exits to the missile cities rather than the cities themselves. And with each of these openings that goes down, Iran's missile forces are left with fewer options, and a launch strategy that carries with it a ton of risk, as each launch signals the existence of yet another opening for the US to target. As for the follow-ups, we'll let Afterburner explain. But when you drop 100 weapons on a certain site, you can definitely use those BLU-109s to penetrate very deep and satisfy even the hardest targets, he says. What this means is that America's B-2s can go even further. The US Air Force says that a B-2 can carry 40,000 pounds of payload. In the BLU-109's case, that amounts to 20 bombs, all of which can be dropped on a single target, perhaps across several runs. Each batch follows on from the last, burrowing deeper each time to allow the US to hit buried targets that it wouldn't otherwise be able to hit with a single bomb. And that's without even considering the other bombs that America's aircraft can drop onto a target once its penetrators have done their job. The B-2s punch a hole. Other bombers can follow up by destroying everything in that hole. And frankly, Iran should be happy that the US and its B-2s are only dropping BLU-109s right now. It could get a whole lot worse, because the US has bunker busters that are far more powerful. We can sum up one of those bunker bombs with 3 words: Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Also known as the MOP, this bunker buster is 15 times the size of the BLU-109, and it can be loaded into the B-2. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies says that the MOP can penetrate as deep as 200 feet, and that it detonates a 5,000-pound warhead once it reaches its target, meaning it packs 10 times as much firepower as the Blue 109. And as with the Blue 109, multiple MOPs can be dropped on a single target to enable deeper penetration. Afterburner points out that Iran is already very familiar with these powerful bombs after the US deployed them against Iran's nuclear facilities during the summer of 2025. So as crazy as it might sound, the US is sort of delivering warning shots with its B-2s right now. Granted, these are warning shots that are tearing through Iran's missile strategy. But the US can hit even harder, and it has the MOP trump card just sitting in its pocket. Let's move on. We've covered what the B-2s did during their latest round of strikes, but we have only touched on what they've achieved. What the US has done here, and it happens whenever a stealthy aircraft like the B-2 or F-35 is deployed, is that it has shaped the battlefield for what it wants to do next. In other words, the US uses stealth bombers like the B-2 to go in, regardless of the air defense situation, and take out targets that other bombers and fighters might not be able to hit. Each of these strikes degrades Iran's warfighting capabilities, which allows non-stealth airframes to move deeper into Iran to conduct follow-on attacks. This is a layered approach to create air supremacy, and allows the US to dictate how Iran operates and what it can do to defend itself against them. Nowhere is that clearer than in what we're seeing now from Iran on the missile front. It would be false to claim that Iran's missiles have been shut down completely. As Afterburner notes, now we're also seeing Iran step up strategic hits so they can fire a lot less, but they're being more strategic. That approach was highlighted on March 8th, when the Times of India reported on Iran carrying out a missile strike against a US naval base in Bahrain. The Wall Street Journal adds that Iran has been trying to hit the radars that support America's missile defenses over the last few days, with Afterburner adding that Iran has also expanded its target scope to include oil refineries and similar targets. Iran is still a threat. But thanks to the B-2s, it's not as much of a threat as it wants to be. Remember that this is a country that built its entire military doctrine around a missile saturation strategy that was supposed to allow it to overwhelm its enemies. If America's B-2s, along with all of its other aerial firepower, hadn't so roundly ruined Iran's missile launch sites during the initial week of the war, we would be seeing Iran carrying out far more strikes, using greater quantities of missiles than we're seeing right now. Naturally, this would lead to even more hits being scored, especially inside Israel, which is a natural target for Iran's missile. Instead, Iran has to get strategic. It has to limit itself to isolated strikes, not only because B-2 bombers have devastated its missile launch sites, but because those that remain become targets as soon as they're used. Afterburner says that Iran has switched to a quick-fire strategy, which involves getting a launcher out into the open, rattling off a missile, and then desperately trying to get that launcher back into cover before the retaliation comes. We say desperately because the US can hit back fast and hard as soon as the missile launch shows up on its collective radar. According to Trump, the US or Israel can carry out a strike against one of Iran's launchers within 4 minutes of it being used. That doesn't leave a whole lot of time for Iran to get that launcher to safety, and it means that every one of its missile launchers can cost it both the launcher itself and the opening that it used to carry out the launch. Bit by bit, Iran's remaining missile capabilities are shut down. Compounding this problem is that US strikes are also being refocused on cutting off Iran's missile manufacturing capabilities now that the B-2s have made attacking deeper inside Iran safe. Whatever plans Iran had to build more missiles have been forcibly put on hold, and that means that every launch that it makes eats into a depleting missile stockpile. The Jewish Institute for National Security of America claimed on March 5th that Iran had lost 75% of its missile launchers, along with up to 52% of its short-range ballistic missiles and 73% of its medium-range ballistic missiles. And that's before the news broke of America's latest deployment of B-2 bombers on March 6th. So what we're seeing here is the systematic destruction of an entire war philosophy. Every deep strike that America's B-2 conducts seals off yet more of Iran's missiles, in addition to making it safer for other US airframes to carry out their attacks. Iran is becoming more strategic with its strikes because it's been forced to do so, and each of those strikes carries with it the enormous risk of American retaliation. And speaking of retaliation, Afterburner says that what all of this adds up to is that the US is starving the Iranian retaliation machine. Sure, Iran is still launching missiles, but it would be deploying so many more if its launchers and missile sites hadn't been crippled by B-2s and their precision penetrating bombs. And that's only going to get worse. In addition to focusing on Iran's means of missile production, the US and Israel are expanding the scope of their own operations. Iran's oil facilities are now on the docket after so much of its military capability had been neutralized. On March 8th, Al Jazeera reported that massive fires were sparked by strikes against 4 oil storage facilities and an oil production transfer center in Tehran and Al Borz. It seems that after crippling Iran's missile launching capabilities with its B-2s during the Phase 2 of its strikes, the US is moving on to Phase 3, that will see it take out the literal fuel that Iran needs to keep its crumbling war machine chugging along. Again, it's systematic destruction. Iran has no answer for it because the B-2s took that answer away. And always lurking just over the horizon is the prospect of yet more B-2s incoming to deliver their surgical strikes to the most valuable targets that are left over in Iran. As the Iran war entered week 2, news broke that the UK had finally given the US permission to use its bases, specifically RAF Fairford and Diego Garcia, the latter of which is nestled away in the Indian Ocean. Why does that matter? Well, B-1B bombers have already arrived at RAF Fairford, and the odds are high that we're going to see B-2s and B-52s follow suit. And with Diego Garcia now in play, all of those bombers have a base that is close to Iran, where they can refuel and restock their weapons. So far, Iran has been hit by B-2s that have to complete 30+ hour round trips to get where they need to go. Soon, that time will be slashed significantly, and that means more B-2 strikes will be conducted at far faster pace against Iran. Iran's crippled air defenses won't be able to do a thing against the upcoming B-2 bomber strikes, and it's not like the country's air force will be able to offer a helping hand. Already much weaker than the US Air Force, Iran's air force has been crippled, and the few airframes it has left face the prospect of the US unleashing the one missile that changed air combat forever against them. Find out what that missile is in our video, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show to see more coverage of Operation Epic Fury. And thank you as always for watching.